Okay, so before we get started, I just want to take a moment and thank Zach Davis. I don't know if he's in here right now or if you've seen him around for putting together, there he is, for putting together this extraordinary thing that we get to participate in. He's a fellow collaborator with Hub and Spoke, where we get this boundless, compassionate energy in our Slack feed every day. And I just can't tell you how much my own show has benefited from his friendship. And if you see him sleeping, just kind of shove him awake and give him a hug. It's cool. All right, let's do this. This is The Lonely Palette, the podcast that returns art history to the masses one painting at a time, or ballet. I'm Tamar Avishai. Welcome to Sound Education. This is a story of a ballet, a painting, and an 8-year-old girl. And I'll just come out and say that the 8-year-old was me, obviously. And I'm about to play you the scariest thing that I, at 8 years old, had ever heard. Right? Like it's terrifying. So this is the Rite of Spring, the modernist Russian composer Igor Stravinsky's epic ballet score, which debuted to rioting and acclaim at the Ballet Russe in Paris in 1913. And the reason I was listening to it when I was 8 years old is not because my parents, who are lovely people and are here right now, were trying to turn me into some kind of baby Einstein. It's because I heard this ballet while watching, half out of my mind with terror, animated dinosaurs kill each other in a Darwinian death match that, in retrospect, was totally inappropriate for kids. This is, of course, Disney's Fantasia from 1940. And if you've never had the pleasure, and I do mean that seriously, Fantasia was only the third feature-length film that Disney ever made, where animators were given free rein to animate famous works of classical music. Most people remember the whimsical hippos in tutus and Mickey losing control of the brooms with the buckets, but not me. The score to the Rite of Spring was animated to tell the narrative of the origin of life on the planet, from the Big Bang to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And all I remember was the fear, and the exhilaration of the fear. The risk that I would take by turning on the VCR in our basement alone, and then hiding the video under the couch cushions when I couldn't take it anymore. And it wasn't just the battling dinosaurs that freaked me out, and I needn't remind you that the early 90s was not a great time to be scared of dinosaurs. Thank you, Steven Spielberg. But dinosaurs are so obviously scary, at least I could cover my eyes. What truly hit my panic button was what came before. The passage of time, the awakening of life on Earth, billions of years of evolution passing in seconds. How quickly time passed. How many times my own lifetime would have been reduced to a quick blink. It was inconceivable how insignificant I was compared to the lifetime of the planet. How indifferent the planet itself was to the life that it sustained. It awakened a primal existential anxiety that I, at 8 years old, had never really stopped to think about, and that really settled into my soul. And it's not just knowing what death is. You know, it's knowing what that means. The concept of time existing without you. It's at once impossible and unbearable that time could be so indifferent. I mean, the Fantasia sequence ends, if you remember, with the dinosaurs going extinct, T-Rex included, in a death march under the blazing sun with shifting tectonic plates swallowing their bones. And all of this, you have to understand, is set to this. a score of grunting, cacophonous, bitonal dissonance, like instruments smashed together in a 10-car pileup. I mean, how do you not want to shove this all under the couch cushion? So you can understand why, when this all ended, the movie, and the threat of dinosaurs attacking me had been neutralized, because they were all dead, thanks to nature, I was left more traumatized than ever. In some ways, it's actually intensified as I've gotten older, which tells me, with some small consolation, that at least I was scared of the right thing. So, I think we can all agree that the Rite of Spring accomplishes exactly what it sets out to do. But what is that? Stravinsky wasn't involved in the Fantasia adaptation, and he apparently wasn't a big fan of it. And he didn't set out to scare 8-year-olds with the ballet, not overtly at least. It was actually conceived out of deep nostalgia for Stravinsky's own childhood in a small town in Russia. And even the origin of that eerie bassoon melody is actually pretty benign. It's influenced by a Lithuanian folk song that Stravinsky listened to as a child. The entire ballet, in fact, was meant to be a celebration of his homeland. The score was meant to evoke what he called, quote-unquote, pagan Russia, and the mystery and the power of, quote, the violent Russian spring that seemed to begin in an hour and was like the whole earth cracking. And diving deeper into Stravinsky's intentions, you begin to realize that maybe this story doesn't need scary dinosaurs to be effective. Instead, maybe he just wanted to take on what had existentially frightened him as a kid. There is a clear and deliberate element of violence and anxiety layered in these lurching symphonic textures. While the ballet itself has no real plot to speak of, it does climax with a chosen maiden sacrificially dancing herself to death to ensure the propagation of springtime. That's where the name comes from. It's unsettling, but not in a T-Rex wringing the neck of a stegosaurus kind of way. Instead, it's an allegorical pagan surrender to the passage of seasons, honoring the extremes of the natural world, what we experience but can't understand. It accepts nature's power and indifference and nonetheless offers up its gratitude. It's meant to tap into something deeply rooted and, as I said, primal. This feeling of nature's power, this feeling of our own powerlessness, thrilling and terrifying all at once. It's an ode to the earth beneath our feet, to the eroticism that agitates our souls, everything overwhelming that we can't control in our own human nature that is born from the natural world. And it's also exactly what European modernist painters at the end of the 19th and beginning of the early 20th century, who were exhausted with industrialization and yearning for this thrill, this romance in an ostensibly simpler time. Painters like Henri Matisse wanted to capture. Let's just jump to my place just a moment. And this brings us to the root of today's investigation. We are all compelled to study what scares us, which means that when I decided I wanted to learn more about the Rite of Spring, I noticed that it was paired up with uncanny regularity to Matisse's The Dance. You know, this iconic painting from 1910 depicting the pared down, spinning out, pulling apart ring around the rosy of bodies, heaving and stomping on a green hilltop against a blue horizon. And just to be clear, there are two of these. One is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and is actually a sketch for the final product, which is the one that we're going to be looking at. Oh, I just gave away something. But anyway, pairing this painting with the ballet, it's not so hard to understand why people do this. Take this written description of the ballet's original choreography. Quote, "It's a sacred circle dance of renewal. The legs and feet held parallel with knees slightly bent. The accompanying movement, a gentle, pulsing, sidestepping motion found in many folk dance styles. A shump-like skip, with one leg drawn up in parallel alignment in front of the body like a hook, with the knee and the foot flexed, end quote. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to want to put these two together. And it's everywhere if you look for it. The internet is chock full of one colloquially illustrating the other. But if you, like I, don't feel that that is rigorous enough evidence of anything meaningful, it's cool. I actually went to the music library at Tufts University to check out the full score just for fun. And this was on the cover. So clearly the universe is telling us something. But the purpose of this talk is not to determine with any degree of certainty if this painting is directly connected to the ballet or if it's just a coincidence. Because it isn't, and it isn't a coincidence, that is. And I'll say at the outset that there's no concrete proof that the two were in any way created in tandem, so let's just disabuse ourselves of that right now. But that doesn't mean that they weren't created in parallel by a French artist and a Russian ballet company peeking over the fence at each other's styles and working in a specific period of the early 20th century that privileged our most primal instincts, that wanted to express the unbridled pagan dynamism of our innermost selves with emotional immediacy and succinct plastic technique. And this period was known as primitivism. So, primitivism, let's take a minute here. It's an ugly word, and it means largely what you would think it would mean in today's terms. Westerners fetishizing non-Western art, which of course encapsulates everything from African to Iberian to Oceanic, replete with a kind of Eurocentric attitude, not unlike Cher in the movie Clueless, confusing El Salvador and Mexico, but getting offended if anyone thought she lived below sunset. One person here has seen Clueless. But it's worth for a moment taking off our post-colonial hats and considering why this art was so seductive to Westerners during this period of modernity, and how genuine their appreciation was for art that seems so unlike their own. If you're living in industrialized Paris, you're stuck in a world of corsets and social mores and soot. Progress becomes synonymous with an overwhelming sense of speed and anxiety. So instead of being thrust forward, many modernist artists chose to retreat. There's a sense of getting back to basics, of returning to a pre-industrialized, pre-Christian world, full of decadent pagan sexuality and nude, lumbering bodies, rendered in a deliberately naive style with thick, crude outlines evocative of woodcuts and crude and blunt carved statues. We see examples of this primitivist style from the 1890s to the 1910s, from Paul Gauguin to the German Expressionists. But for our purposes now, let's focus on Matisse, Fauvism, and that time he went to Russia. To really understand Matisse, you really need to understand Fauvism, which means you really need to understand color. Color was the bread and butter and knife and plate for the Fauvists. They were defined by this impulsive brushwork that was borrowed from the Impressionists and the emotional, explosive, and primal use of color pioneered by the Post-Impressionists. And though they only exhibited for a short time, around 1904 to 1908, their ability to bridge the expressive artists who had influenced them and the expressionism that they would then influence rippled throughout the rest of the century. And it's not a far leap from Van Gogh to Fauvism to Expressionism. These were artists who painted as they felt, who didn't just observe a landscape, they experienced it, and who used high-keyed, often discordant colors to grab your eyeballs and pull you in. Even the name Fauvist is French for wild beast, and it's easy to imagine the thrilling rush you'd experience if you were trapped in a pen with one of these painters. And Matisse in particular experimented with Fauvism as though attempting to capture a Garden of Eden before the fall. A world where human beings are unconstrained by those corsets, by shame, by the chilly critical distance a society evokes by living in time, in history, in a world built upon the structures of the past and looking towards progress promised by the future. All of this rush on this existential continuum, he seems to be saying, kind of dismissively. I mean, why can't we ever just be? Why not live in the now, experience the immediate calm of a world without memory or without expectation, a world that is just ahistorical, atemporal, where we can literally just lie around in a primordial post-coital stasis? What would that world look like? I'll show you what it looks like. Matisse's The Joy of Life from 1905 to 1906, which is a lot less frenetic than the other Fauvist works, but no less vivid. Here, we see a world of simplified forms, trees and figures without any excessive detail to agitate the eye. And though no single facet of the painting is complete, bodies morph into bodies, trees become foliage, become sky, you never lose the overall wholeness, that sensation of relaxed, languid calm. It takes more than, a long weekend to achieve what's being evoked by this painting, is what I'm saying. Even the dancers in the background, whom you might recognize as a precursor to the painting in question, they almost look like they're standing still. There's 6 of them, a nice, even number, perfectly balanced and harmonious. They add joy, maybe, but no real sense of dynamic energy. And this calm, being in the moment, was exactly what the quote-unquote primitive provided European painters. A validation that the West had lost the ability to tap into our primal needs, and that non-Western aesthetics gave them back the tools to achieve this atemporal bliss that is promised by a life lived according to instinct. Seems pretty sweet. But of course, there is a flip side to this. A life lived by instinct is inherently ruled by the amygdala, which controls our fight and flight responses, and that shuddering shock of adrenaline is, of course, the complete opposite of rational, critical thought. As primitivism matured into its adolescence, it became more and more obvious that the natural inverse to primal happiness is primal fear, that irrationality triggers panic, that sexual desire so quickly morphs into sexual anxiety. A key example of this turn from the aesthetic perspective is found in Picasso's iconic painting Demoiselle d'Avignon from 1907. Here, the immediacy turns from languid to brutal, as these 5 prostitutes, some wearing African masks, stare you down with gazes sharp enough to draw blood. This painting has long been described as the predecessor to Cubism, but I would strongly argue that we're looking at peak primitivism here, when that cute puppy you always meant to train finally realizes it has fangs. Cubism is at its core an intellectual exercise, and this painting is not. This painting is devastating. It's a painting of our worst sexual anxieties realized, an exercise in tension and tedium, in the transactional flatness of sexuality offered and eroticism denied. And you have to think that this turn that primitivism had taken during these years influenced Matisse when he painted The Dance in 1910, just 3 years later. And first, a little bit of background on this painting. In 1906, Matisse was first introduced to the Russian collector Serge Shukin, who would come to be one of his most important patrons. By 1913, he owned something like 36 of his paintings. In 1909, Shukin commissioned The Dance for his home. And in the years that Matisse was cultivating this relationship, he spent a good chunk of time in Russia, positively delighted by the icons of Russian folk art that he was encountering. Russia was also having a primitivist moment of its own, which we already know because Stravinsky was experiencing this as he nostalgically wrote the ballet score. Russian artists and collectors presented Matisse with these folk and outsider artworks during his visits, and he was so exhilarated by them that he apparently couldn't even sleep. Quote, "In these icons," he wrote, "the soul of the artists who painted them opens out like a mystical flower, and from them we ought to learn how to really understand primitivist art. All French artists should come to learn it in Russia," end quote. And in this post-Demoiselle d'Avignon world, engaged in a rivalry of sorts with Picasso, so he had to do his own thing, and following his passionate, authentic encounter with these Russian icons that he felt like were the real core of primitivism, Matisse tackled those dancers from the joy of life again, but they're different this time. Their circle is distorted. They're 5 odd figures instead of a nice even 6, which strains their reach for one another. They're deliberately off-kilter and unbalanced. They simultaneously cleave the earth with their stomps and levitate above it, and embrace the crude, the unfinished, in favor of a dynamic sense of primal wholeness. Which brings us back to the ballet. Whose choreography, score, set design, and entire ethos I've basically just described. In the same way that Matisse and the Fauvists were tossing aside realistic human proportions in order to capture emotional expression and aesthetic wholeness, so too did Václav Nijinsky, the hotshot young choreographer of the Ballet Russe, the Russian ballet company that was based in Paris, and the original choreographer of the Rite of Spring. And you're seeing here the Joffrey Ballet Company in New York, 1987, were able to actually piece together the original choreography of the Rite of Spring. So I think this is another version of that ballet when it hit its centennial. So you have to realize that this ballet wasn't intended to be heard without being seen, too. Nijinsky tossed aside classical dance methodology in favor of sculptural blunt lines of movement that were modeled after the very same pagan statues that had so thrilled Matisse and his fellow Fauvists. I mean, compare this dance to Derain, who's another Fauvist, his The Dance from 1905. And Nijinsky used the Rite of Spring in particular to experiment with this primitivist aesthetic that was all the rage in the art world because he wanted to bring it to the dance world too. He freed the body from the restrictions of traditional ballet and totally imposed others. These lurching movements from a restricted base, inverting postures, reversing the positions of academic dance from outward to inward. Arms that had always gracefully extended forward were now twisted back. Instead of the quote-unquote conquest of the air that had always defined classical ballet, Nijinsky emphasized the other side of gravity. What goes up must come back down. His dance is characterized by stomps, those stomps you heard at the beginning, by vast explosive leaps and the subsequent contact with the stage. It was in fact these stomps that particularly brutalized the audience in the infamous 1913 premiere. One chief complaint was that they couldn't even hear the music anymore over the pounding on the stage. The challenge for these dancers wasn't just virtuosity, it was plain physical endurance. It was agony sustaining these postures. It was so frustrating trying to keep count to Stravinsky's freaky time signatures. And there are documented complaints of their headaches and bruised feet from the force of stomping and jumping without the added boost from a traditional plie. And you can only imagine how envious they must have been of Matisse's swirling figures. I mean, after all, they didn't actually have to comply with the laws of gravity when they were asked to do the exact same thing. Because really, from an aesthetic perspective, it is the exact same thing. And not just because Nijinsky incorporated the same circular sidestep folk dance in honor of Russian primitivism in general, and Stravinsky's nostalgic childhood memories in particular, but because both the choreography and the painting are entirely comfortable using the human body for its primal energy, rather than its anatomical accuracy. To truly experience human nature, they both seem to be saying, means to flout the expectation that what you're seeing could ever actually exist in nature. And this is where I want to return to this idea of wholeness. This whole that equals more than the sum of its parts, that both Nijinsky and Matisse referred to as plastic. In art, plasticity is the idea of getting rid of any erroneous detail, of paring down visuals to their most essential lines. This inevitably comes at the expense of all the detail that fleshes out an image, but as Matisse famously said, exactitude is not truth. Famous to me, my mom had this up in her studio when I was a kid. But he's saying that what you may lose in accuracy, you gain in the depiction of a larger idea. When asked how a painting of his could be finished when he had only completed 3 of the figure's fingers, he replied, quote, "I couldn't put in the other 2 without throwing the whole out of the drawing. It would destroy the composition and the unity of my ideal," end quote. Similarly, Nijinsky, heavily influenced by the barefoot instinctual movements of Isadora Duncan, experimented with what he called danse plastique, which is characterized by taut minimal movements, again, nothing erroneous, that became, quote, "a kinetic metaphor for primitive wholeness," according to the New Yorker dance critic Joan Accartello. Gone were the classical curlicues of traditional ballet in favor of the body's direct, intractable attack. And you can also see this aesthetic plasticity in the Rite of Spring sets, which were designed by Nicholas Roerich, the foremost expert in Russian folk art at the time. And you might notice that it bears an uncanny resemblance to the background of the dance, this hilltop. Both use the same plains, horizontal bands of ground and sky bisected by hills that are composed of this undulating line. Both are meant to recede behind the potent dynamism that they support. And both are powerful examples of the energy teeming beneath the surface of the earth. And this is when we think back to Stravinsky's description of the Russian spring that seemed to begin in an hour and was like the whole earth was cracking. The cracking of the earth, this sense of roiling, syncopated dynamism, the overwhelming presence of nature, its power, our powerlessness, are what we are meant to hear in every note of Stravinsky's score. I'm telling you, this music, it's haunting and it's savage and it's brutally seductive. Melodies stay consonant for just long enough to lower our defenses, and then bam, we're obliterated by these stomps, just when we're the most vulnerable to them. But we continue to listen. We continue to stay vulnerable. It's all we can really do. We're human beings squatting on an indifferent earth, living blinks of lifetimes. We don't really have a choice. So we give ourselves over to it. We give ourselves over to it. Matisse, Stravinsky, me, you. It's better than just being scared all the time. We get so excited by Russian icons that we can't sleep at night. We attempt to create something so new that it causes a riot. We bruise our dancers' feet in an attempt to articulate it. And when we can't take it anymore, we shove all the anxiety of the planet under a couch cushion, comforted by the assurance that at least we're all scared of the right thing.